Earlier this year, a man from Ottawa was convicted of hate speech and terrorism-related offences for his connection to Atomwaffen division, a quite vile neo-Nazi group. While the terrorism charges were justified, the implication is also that people can get sent to prison for a significant amount of time based on their speech. I'm definitely not defending this man, but the trend towards criminalizing speech should concern us all. Politicians and bureaucrats are using what they understand as hate as a pretext to expand the state's power over legitimate expression, and often, not always, if it's conservative or right-wing coded expression. Joining me to break it down is Josh Dehaas from the Centre for Constitutional Freedoms and the co-host of the Not Reserving Judgment podcast. Let's talk about the state of civil liberties in Canada, who decides what extreme means, and how far the chill on speech has spread. I'm Melanie Bennet. This is Disrupted. Josh, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation.
I want to talk to you about something curious. It's not something I talk about very often, but let's talk about Nazis and terrorism. Let's just go through a little bit of what I know, and I'd love to hear your opinion about it. So we've just found out that a man in his late 20s, Patrick Gordon MacDonald, or earlier this year, was charged with promoting hate speech, participating in activities of a terror group, and facilitating terrorist activities. And during the trial, so basically this guy was called Dark Foreigner, and it was this whole Atomwaffen group, and it was this neo-Nazi group, and all this evidence was gathered, and he was charged and convicted, I believe, and sentenced to 10 years for hate speech for this neo-Nazi group. And you probably know a lot more about this than I do, and I'm dead curious. What do you know about this case?
Well, the sentencing just came down, and it's a 10-year sentence for all three of the convictions that you just mentioned. So 2, promotion and contributing to terrorism charges, which is Section 83 of the Criminal Code. And then also a conviction on willful promotion of hatred against an identifiable group, in this case, Jewish people, which is one of the main hate speech provisions. It's one of the ones that's quite controversial in Canada, but that's been upheld by the Supreme Court. And, a 10-year sentence is pretty unusual. And even to have hate speech charges like this made, never mind have a person conviction, is not very common in Canada. So this case it's kind of a big deal. It tells us a lot about, when you can charge people who are making videos, as this person has been convicted of doing, that promote terrorism, in this case through recruitment, or that are, racist Nazi videos, and in this case led to a conviction for hate speech.
So it was on the basis of the videos that he was convicted? Is that right?
Right. So what happened is he was, this is according to the court decision, was part of this Atomwaffen group, which has become a listed terrorist group. That happened in 2021. But when these videos were made, which are essentially recruitment videos, these are videos where, you have guys dressed up in dark clothing with Nazi symbols and carrying machine guns, that sort of thing, encouraging people to take down the global cabal of, who that supposedly runs the country, just the typical, stereotypes that we always hear. So they were making these recruitment videos, and that was enough to convict of the terrorism charges. So, the contributing to a terrorist group. And the videos, some of the statements made in the videos were what was decided to be the willful promotion of hatred. And what makes the latter part really interesting to me is these are online videos. And when you think of hate speech nowadays, we think about it all occurring online. But of course, when it first started, when these laws were first invented, they've been around since 1970 in Canada. There was no internet. So there's a part of it that says private communications don't count. So if you're talking privately, that's not going to be hate speech. But that left a question about whether speech on the internet is private communications or whether that's public. And courts in Quebec have in the past found that, posting hateful speech on Facebook, for example, counts as criminal hate speech that can land you in jail. But it's really not that common outside of Quebec to be charged for online hate speech. And here, not only was he charged, but he was convicted. So that's part of what makes this so interesting in 2025.
Yeah, small detail from the decision, I noted that this man in his late 20s, the evidence was obtained from his bedroom in his parents' basement, which I felt, I don't know, just had to live up to a stereotype in this particular case. But it also says in the Globe and Mail that the RCMP called this particular case the first case in Canada involving both terrorism and hate propaganda offences laid against someone for promoting violent far-right ideology. Now, we're not a fan of Nazis, so a lot of people may go, okay, this is a great idea. We don't want the global elite conspiracy to be propagating, and so maybe this is a good decision. But you were telling me before that you had some concerns about free speech in this particular case, and I thought maybe you could explain a little bit what your position is on that.
Yeah, so I think my concerns related to speech are, not particularly necessarily related to this person or his speech, but the idea is that when you're talking about putting somebody in jail for, at the end of the day, what are essentially words, that is a scary proposition because it's so subjective to try and define what words would count as hatred and what words are not going to be considered hatred and land you in prison for years. This is a problem that courts have struggled with from the beginning of these hate speech laws being on the books in the first place, because, lots of things that people say are controversial and other people will say, well, that's hateful. If you criticize women for wearing hijabs, some women will say that's anti-Islamic hate. Other people will say, well, encouraging women to wear hijabs is anti-female hate or misogyny. It's really hard to know what is going to be considered hateful or not. And the court has said in the past, well, we can define it as the manifestations of the most extreme forms of the emotion represented by the words detestation and vilification. And then it's really hard to know what that means. So this later gets redefined, and you're told to look for the hallmarks of hatred, which can include things like, there's a global conspiracy by a group to take over the world. But, in this case, some of the evidence for what was considered hate speech, in my opinion, was pretty weak, like burning Israeli, American, and EU flags. I'm not sure how you can hate the EU, but apparently burning those flags was part of what pointed to hate speech in this case.
Flying the St. George Cross in the UK right now is starting to be considered a hate symbol as well, so that's not really that surprising.
Right, and that's a perfect example of just how subjective this is. People say, well, the context of putting up the English flag is that you're a racist, and other people say, no, I'm a patriot, and that's my only message here, right? So once you start criminalizing people for their words as opposed to their actual actions, like, threatening to actually do some sort of terrorism, which is perfectly justifiable to imprison somebody for, we get into this really difficult slippery slope that creates a lot of free speech chill because people just don't know where the line is. They just don't know what they can or can't say.
Yeah, I don't know the exact date, but I'm aware that in America, free speech advocates, I can't remember their name exactly. Sorry, it's gone over my head right this second. But on the same basis of what you were talking about, I know that they defended these marches of I guess, white supremacists in Jewish areas in the United States on the basis of you needed to protect distasteful, maybe even hateful speech to actually have freedom of expression because it was speech. And so it's interesting in Canada that this is happening for this particular in this particular case. But I'm also curious, Is it relevant, or do you think it's relevant that the RCMP says this is the first case like this, and it happens to be for right-wing extremism, in Canada we're seeing a lot of this extremism actually on the left, and that gets ignored a lot. So I was wondering if you saw that as an important detail in this at all.
I certainly thought about that because, court cases take a long time to get through the courts. So this is about events that happened years ago, right? So we're only just getting to the conviction and sentencing this year. But what we've seen in the past 2 years is a lot of people speaking out against Israel in particular. And I think all of that speech ought to be protected. I think any speech that is, not going to cause immediate physical consequences, like inciting a riot or inciting violence against people, or is not, in some physically harmful form, all speech should essentially be allowed, no matter how odious it is. But when you see what happened in this case, these were recruitment videos, so they were pretty clear terrorist activity. But so much of what's going on with people supporting Hamas or supporting Hezbollah gets pretty close to these lines also of, aiding terrorist groups. Well, we see them flying
actual terrorist flags, right? We're not talking about the St. George Cross or the European Union flag or things like that. We're talking about the flags that represent actual terrorist groups, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas, and we're not seeing any action on that.
The question is, if you're flying the flag, are you recruiting someone, just like this person was convicted of recruiting people through his videos? And it's a fine line, right? You can say on the one hand that's speech and all speech should be allowed, but that's not the law in Canada. I mean, those are my personal beliefs, but that's not the law. So are we going to start seeing charges for Hamas and Hezbollah supporters who are, I think, exist in Canada in pretty large numbers? I think it's clear because we do see the flags. There's a bumper sticker on a car driving around in suburban Toronto that is the face of Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas, now deceased, thankfully. But is that promotion of terrorism? And the answer is we don't know. We just don't know what a court would do. But if you're going to prosecute people for right-wing extremism, it needs to be equally meted out when it comes to left-wing extremism or Hamas or Hezbollah. I don't know if you would label that left wing, but I think you know what I mean. It has to be equal.
It's not, but it has been adopted by people who would often consider themselves to be progressive or leftist, and so that's why I kind of put it into that category, because there seems to be this alliance going on between these particular groups for that particular matter. But going back to the focus on speech and criminalizing speech when it comes to political views, I'm going to change the subject just slightly, because you've mentioned Sean Foyt and the situation with Sean Foyt and how he's being targeted. Admittedly, this is not somebody who's been criminally charged or anything like that, but you sort of see the same dichotomy with the Sean Foyt situation, where this American preacher who supported the American president, came to do shows. He'd been to Canada many times before. He did this tour this summer, and the media just absolutely had a field day on him. He got cancelled all over the place. And this was happening at the same time as another preacher, an Islamic preacher, who has been linked to curious things that I reported on, and not a peep about any of that whatsoever. And so you do see, I find it concerning that you see an attack on speech for a particular worldview, but not others. Do you want to talk a little bit about Sean Foyt?
Yeah, so I think that's a really astute point. This is the problem, is when you start letting the government and the courts decide what words you can and cannot say, which people are allowed to speak or not speak, then these are the things that happen. Certain viewpoints, and it's usually the minority viewpoint, gets completely silenced, and other viewpoints are allowed to go ahead. So, Sean Foyt, I'm sure your listeners know, is a Christian singer. He's associated with the MAGA movement. And he had, I believe it was 9 shows, either have his permits revoked or not granted in the first place in different cities and parts of Canada. And this was because people didn't like things he had said online. Most of them were about LGBTQ issues, but none of them, in my opinion, came close to hate speech, except perhaps one comment, which was about what happened was somebody posted a video of a protest against a hospital in New York that had stopped giving gender reassignment surgeries to minors. At least that's how Foyt described it. And he said that the Bible has something to say about this, the word millstones, and he quoted a Bible passage. So on our very unclear free speech law in Canada, it's possible you could argue that that's hateful and discriminatory. I don't think that would get very far in court at all. And certainly you can't, preemptively cancel people's concerts because you think they might do a hate speech in the future, which is essentially what happened here. So I think this is one of the most egregious periods for free speech in Canada this past summer, just seeing cancellation after cancellation and very few people standing up and saying, wait a minute, this is wrong. If you can cancel Sean Foyt because he's said some things on Twitter that progressives don't like, progressives should realize that this will come back and bite them too, because we could have a pretty far right government in the future that says drag queen story hours should not happen in public spaces, or controversial rappers shouldn't be allowed to perform, or the Imam case is a great one, because as much as we might not like what he has to say, as much as we might find that homophobic, he should be allowed to speak. Speech itself should never be a crime.
Yeah, I often wonder how I feel about that too, because when it's something that you feel strongly about, then maybe you think, yes, that person should be stopped from saying those things. And so it can be difficult to extend the same courtesies to others when you have very strong views about those particular things. So now we've talked about the diagnosis of the issue, obviously the speech issue, but what's the prognosis in terms of the legal system in Canada? Where are we going?
It's really hard to say. So legally, the bad free speech jurisprudence really started in the 1980s. And Keekstra, so this is the case of an Alberta teacher who was also an anti-Semite, a theme in today's show, had been teaching his kids, anti-Semitic tropes, and obviously should have been fired. But the question was whether his free speech could prevent him from actually going to jail for, at the end of the day, what were just words, as awful as they were. In that decision, the Supreme Court upheld the government's the government's hate speech law, the same one that we were just talking about earlier with this new person convicted. And so we know in Canada that these laws will be upheld. Now, over the past couple decades, there have been some improvements in the law. For example, the Mike Ward case, the case of a comedian who was forced to pay money originally to the mother of a boy and a boy with a disability for making fun of them. This is a famous boy, just making fun of them in a comedy routine. He was supposed to pay them $42,000, and the Supreme Court said, actually, no, you can't fine people that much money for jokes. People can handle a joke.
Yeah.
Very slim margin. So, the Supreme Court has changed since then. That was a 5-4 decision. It could easily go the other way, 5-4 in the next free speech case, and it could be the end of free speech. So things are not looking great in the courts. It's also worth noting that, the person who appointed most judges in Canada over the past decade was Justin Trudeau, and he was not well known for preserving free speech. He introduced several laws that implicated free speech, some in quite serious ways, and they didn't all pass, but they could come back now that we have another new Liberal government that may or may not make shutting down what they see as discriminatory speech online a priority. So not looking good in the courts, and also not looking great from a political democratic point of view.
Well, while I've got you here, I want to ask your opinion on a relevant but slightly adjacent issue, and that's the Quebec prayer ban that's being proposed. Because there's a lot of opinions going around about that. A lot of people are very supportive of this because basically what happened is you have these groups of Muslims praying in front of various places, but also in Toronto, it's on the streets. But the ban is in Quebec. And I know what my feelings are about this, but what's your opinion on the prayer ban?
Well, you were talking earlier about how it can be really hard to be principled on these things because, when there's somebody that you see as hateful or harmful, you want to shut down. Your instinct is to try and shut down their speech as well. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that as long as it's not the government doing it, as long as it's, social approbation that's causing the speech to be shut down.
Stigmatizing.
Yeah, social stigma. Like, we don't need the government to do this. And when the government decides, it's a problem. But when we decide as individuals or society, that's how it's supposed to work. In terms of the prayer ban, so in some cases, mass prayers have been held in the middle of streets, blocking traffic. And that is already illegal. That is blockading.
And on private property.
Right. And if it's on private property, that's also illegal. That's trespassing. And these are the things that a lot of people fail to understand is that, your right to freedom of expression is not limitless. And if you look at the rule I was talking about earlier, you should never be able to limit ideas in a free society. But if the form is harmful, like trespass or blockading, that's perfectly legitimate to limit.
Noise,
so
is that included?
Nuisance noise, that's another one. If you're using your loudspeaker to do your call to prayer, I think that is something that can be ticketed if your noise is, a nuisance to other people. And we're not seeing tickets handed out for that, much to my dismay. But in terms of banning prayer, like if it's in public spaces, even if it's outside Notre Dame, which is the big cathedral where this has caused a lot of consternation, even if you think that's a sacred place and that there shouldn't be Muslims praying there because it's somehow an assault on Canadian society or Christian society, even if you hold those views, I don't think that you can constitutionally ban that because it's a content-based restriction. It's about the idea, and we all have a right to gather in public spaces. We all have a right to express ourselves in public spaces. So if that's what Quebec goes ahead and does and says you can't pray anywhere in public spaces, that is clearly unconstitutional. And as much as, some people might think, well, these people who are praying, they support Hamas. I'm not saying they necessarily do, but this is the thinking people have, or these people are anti-Canada somehow. Even if you think that, their rights are equal to yours, and what makes Canada better than a lot of places like Gaza, for instance, is that we have these liberal values where everybody's speech is supposed to be treated equally. It isn't always in practice, but we should try and stick to that principle. And the better solution here in Quebec is just, enforce the laws we actually have.
Exist.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that concerns me. I'll share my own opinion on this. It does concern me that we have laws that we can enforce, and instead it's worrying to me to see so many people willing to go for a blunt weapon, like trying to criminalize people's speech, when you can actually apply all these other laws, but apply them equally. Not just apply them to some people and not to others based on their intersectional status and how many oppression points that they have and so on and so forth. So I guess I'm quite similar to you in that regard for that particular topic. But this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've often asked myself whether I would defend the expression or speech of people that I find despicable. And I understand the instinct of wanting to ban things that we hate altogether. But it does worry me that more and more people appear to be championing censorship rather than questioning what's going on. I'd love to know what you think in the comments, especially. I'm Melanie Bennet. Thanks for watching.